comes to us from Fitchburg State University in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. Dr. Svolba earned his PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago, where he wrote his dissertation on Harry Frankfurt, who he's going to present on today. He taught for several years at the University of Illinois at Chicago and is currently assistant professor in humanities at Fitchburg State University in central Massachusetts. He's published work in philosophical explorations and science, religion, and culture. He's also published 2 edited collections exploring philosophical themes in the television shows Curb Your Enthusiasm or the films actually, Curb Your Enthusiasm and The Big Lebowski. And he's recently been working on a text called Rawlsian Arguments for Animal Rights. He also lets us know here that he is obsessed with chess. So, if you want to do chess questions afterwards, I'm sure he'll be willing to engage with you on that as well. He prefers it. Today, right, we're here to hear about Frankfurt on moral responsibility, and I'd like you all to join me in welcoming Professor Svolba.
Okay, well, thank you very much. My accomplishments don't sound quite so paltry when you list them off like that, one after the other. It's kind of nice. First, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me and having me. Thanks to you, Professor Kazarian, for all the work you did setting this up, and to Professor Bauer for being such a great host. I'm going to take you through a PowerPoint. Hopefully there won't be any glitches. It should go about 45 or 50 minutes tops, and then we can do a Q&A. All right? So that's not good. And it was going so smoothly. So, 3 points that I want to talk to you guys about today. The first, what are we talking about when we talk about moral responsibility? And the we here means philosophers, right? What do philosophers mean when they talk about moral responsibility? Second point, how does Harry Frankfurt's account of moral responsibility, a kind of hero of mine, the guy I wrote my dissertation on, how does his account of moral responsibility differ from other influential accounts? And there I'll be particularly interested to kind of make a case for Frankfurt making some important contributions to the already bewildering array of views on offer. And then the third point are the counterexamples to Frankfurt's account of moral responsibility, really as damning as they first appear. Obviously, I'm going to argue that they're not. It would be a bit strange to come all this way to tell you, yep, the critics are right. Let's go home. Okay. Okay. All right, we have to either use it or not use it, though, because if I'm caught in between, Sandy probably did something to it. Is this a practical joke you play on all your invited guests? Okay, so I'm starting here with the concept of moral responsibility. What are we talking about when we talk about moral responsibility? That's the great English philosopher Peter Strawson, looking awfully smug and satisfied with himself. He wrote in 1962 an essay called Freedom and Resentment, which was agenda setting and pretty much determined all the subsequent literature how it would treat the concept of moral responsibility. And what he wanted to do in this essay at first was just kind of give a rich phenomenological description of our concept of moral responsibility and our practice of moral responsibility from the ground, as it were, right? And so it starts with this idea of the basic demand. The basic demand for Strawson means a demand that we all make of each other to show regard or goodwill towards each other, right? To show some level of regard or goodwill for the interests of other people and the well-being of other people. The basic demand is real, by the way. We obviously don't explicitly address others with the basic demand, but monitor your reaction the next time somebody cuts you off in traffic or doesn't let you merge or closes the door on you as you're walking through, right? That's when you realize that there was a demand, an implicit demand being made. And Strawson's idea was that we move through the social world issuing this basic demand to each other, and when it's met by others, we're liable to feel what he calls the participant reactive attitudes. So when we feel like the basic demand is being met, we feel things like gratitude and esteem for others. We then might engage in actions like praising or rewarding. On the other hand, and these happen to be the more interesting cases, When we feel like the basic demand is not being met by others, we're liable to feel things like resentment, moral anger, indignation, contempt. And it leads to actions like blaming, shaming, ostracizing, the erosion of social relationships, and so forth. So this kind of constellation of things, the demand, the reactive attitudes, the actions that the reactive attitudes tend to engender, this constellation of things kind of makes up our practice of holding each other morally responsible. And when philosophers are talking about moral responsibility, by and large, they're talking about this Straussian conception of the practice of holding morally responsible, right? Now, after kind of setting out the phenomenology of our moral experience, Strawson goes on to talk about excusing conditions and the threat of determinism. By excusing conditions, he means basically, when do we think it's reasonable to suspend the reactive attitudes? When do we think it's reasonable to not hold people morally responsible, or to let them off the hook, as it were, right? This has become kind of the central question in philosophical accounts of moral responsibility. Who's morally responsible, right? Who belongs in the class of morally responsible agents? Why? And when do members of that class get let off the hook? When do we suspend the reactive attitudes? And so Strawson's idea was, well, there are two sorts of cases when we're liable to suspend the reactive attitudes. In one sort of case, it's because we think the agent in question is just not a fit subject for the reactive attitudes or target for the reactive attitudes due to perhaps an inability to understand the basic demand, right? The clearest case of that is going to be with non-human animals, children. They can't understand the basic demand, so they're off the hook. We don't hold the reactive attitudes in relation to what they do to us, even though what they do to us might adversely affect our interests, right? But there are other more complicated cases like, adult human beings who are insane or in some way cognitively addled, and then it's not so clear whether we should feel the reactive attitudes in response to the harm they do or not, etc. But so that was one class of excusing conditions. We don't hold X morally responsible because they're somehow outside the class of morally responsible agents. The second excusing condition, as Strawson calls it, has to do with those who are in the class, but for some reason we don't think, under the specific circumstances, holding the person morally responsible makes sense, right? So he gives the example of somebody who hurts you, steps on your hand or something. It's a weird image. I don't know why your hand is on the floor, but he steps on your hand, but it was an accident. He didn't mean to. In a case like that, he's a morally responsible agent, somebody who's normally liable to the reactive attitudes. But in this particular case, because the harm he did to you was unintentional, you let him off the hook, right? Another interesting aspect of Strawson's essay, and I really can't overemphasize how influential this essay, Freedom and Resentment, was. All the philosophical literature on moral responsibility defines itself in one way or another relative to Strawson's kind of seminal essay. But another thing Strawson thought about and talked about in this essay was, well, the threat of causal determinism. This might be an unfamiliar concept to you guys, but causal determinism is this view that everything that happens in the natural world, and our choices take place in the natural world, our actions take place in the natural world, everything that happens is the result of prior events together with the laws of nature, right? Everything that happens had to happen given prior events together with the laws of nature. And since the early Greek philosophers have done a lot of hand-wringing about to what extent does that picture of the universe, one that is awfully compelling, right? To what extent does that picture of the universe rule out things like freedom and responsibility? And Strawson wanted to argue that, well, from one perspective at least, it's just completely irrelevant. It doesn't touch our ordinary practice of holding each other responsible. And so his point was, basically, if Nathan does something that harms me, our practice does not allow Nathan to say, look, before you get so upset, why don't you keep in mind that everything I do is the result of prior events together with the laws of nature, right? Metaphysics doesn't excuse in our practice, right? So even if metaphysics ultimately undermines our practice itself gives no place for metaphysical excuses, right? It allows excuses like I didn't mean it, and it allows excuses like don't be angry with Nathan, he's insane, or something like that. Bad example. But it allows those kinds of excuses. It does not allow, well, causal determinism is true, so, right? So this was Strawson's point. I'm going to hit the forward button now. Okay, so some of you might have noticed that on Professor Kazarian's awfully cool poster, there is a still shot of Petra Laszlo. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this woman or this case. In September, it was generating a lot of kind of public internet shaming. I'm not editorializing. I think a lot of it was deserved. But she's the Hungarian camera woman who, unfortunately, basically is caught on film. I mean, it's astonishingly idiotic behavior. It really is. But anyway, she's this Hungarian camera woman who's been caught on film kicking and tripping refugees, right? I think at this, is it the Syrian border? I'm not sure where it was. Serbian border, maybe? Yeah, Serbian border. So she's caught on camera kicking and tripping refugees, and that didn't interest me. You know, people are doing despicable things all the time. What interested me was her statement afterwards. And her statement is interesting in a lot of ways. I mean, it's an apology in the full sense of the word, right? Because it's both an expression of contrition while at the same time a defense of herself, right? So she writes, "I'm very sorry for the incident, and as a mother I am especially sorry for the fact that fate pushed a child in my way." Let's hope that sounds better in Hungarian. Okay? Maybe there's like a Hungarian idiom that really, really works there. In English, it's not so good. I mean, fate pushed a child right into my boot. I started to panic, and as I rewatched the film, and this part is my emphasis, it seems as if it were not even me. That's the phrase that really kind of piqued my interest, because, as you'll see, the subject of my dissertation is very big on this idea of kind of experiences of our own agency in which we feel alienated or estranged from our own activity. And then she ties this like distancing from the action to the question of what she deserves, right? To the question, in other words, of what our reactive attitude should be. And she says, look, I do not deserve the political witch hunts against me, the smears or the death threats. I'm just a woman, and now an unemployed mother of small children. She was fired, who made a bad decision in a situation of panic. I am truly sorry. So I'm really not the least bit interested in figuring out Petra Laszlo's responsibility for what she did and whether we're justified in shaming her and saying she's a horrible human being. I'm really interested in the form of her explanation or apology, right? The fact that she doesn't notice, here are the things she doesn't say. She doesn't say, look, it was an accident. I had a spontaneous urge to dance, and a baby got in the way of my foot. You know, she doesn't say that. She doesn't say, well, I was confused about the basic demand. I didn't know it applies to refugee children. Or so. She didn't claim ignorance, right? So it wasn't a claim of ignorance. It wasn't a claim of accident. Nobody on her behalf said, look, you don't understand, Petra's not all there. She's not a morally responsible agent. The camera's not even hooked up. We just let her run around with it. Right? So there was none of that, don't hold her as a responsible agent. So in a way, all of the typical excuses that our practice allows as being legitimate and relevant, at least according to the philosophers, this looks like it doesn't quite fit. It's different. It's new. Or it's not new, but from a philosophical point of view, it seems new, right? It seems as if it were not even me. It was intentional, but somehow it wasn't me doing it. That's a very interesting thought, I think. Okay, so I want to share with you another kind of similar case, Tomas's case. So, yeah, if Nathan can get it working, I mean, it's worth seeing just because it's such a great scene, right? And this was going to be the highlight of my talk, so I'm really devastated now. That's right. This talk is what philosophers call an organic unity, right? So the fact that this didn't work, the rest can't be expected to work either. Like it all hangs together. So this is a scene, a wonderful scene from this movie called Force Majeure, a Swedish movie. and it's about a kind of bourgeois Swedish family that are maybe in the French Alps on a ski vacation. And they're at an outdoor cafe, and it looks like there's an avalanche. And what happens is they think it's just like, Nathan, I don't know what the term is, but occasionally they'll deliberately kind of make small avalanches to like clear the mountain of... They were doing something like that. So he thought it was controlled. But as it came closer and closer, at some point his children start screaming, and the father, husband, this successful kind of man, terrified, just picks up his phone and runs. And while he's running, he actually, I think, pushes someone aside. Meanwhile, his wife and children are just left back at the table. And of course, as it happens, the avalanche stops before it gets to that cafe, and he rather sheepishly walks back to the table. And the rest of the movie is about what happens right after this early scene in which his wife thinks he acts utterly shamefully. And more interestingly, I think it kind of precipitates for Tomas a total identity crisis. Because he, like Petra, does not recognize himself in the activity or the action, right? He says that wasn't me, I don't know what happened. He says at one point, I'm a victim of my bloody instincts, right? As if there's some kind of motivational force within me that is responsible for that action. That is not me. I do not identify with it. As a way of saying, suspend your reactive attitudes, or at least modify them accordingly, right? I do not stand behind that conduct. Really great clip. I'm not doing it justice, okay? I mean, it's really, what a shame. Okay, so those two kinds of cases, we can call them alienation cases or estrangement cases. They remind me of Harry Frankfurt's kind of conception of the person and his moral psychology more generally. There's an image that hits a bit too close to home, that one on the right. I'll explain that in a second. So Frankfurt's kind of fundamental theme from early on in his career was what distinguishes persons from non-persons. And he said, interestingly, that the fundamental difference between persons and non-persons lies in the structure of a person's will. And so I'll read these passages in my best audiobook voice, but this is from a book called Reasons of Love. And he says, animals of various lesser species also have desires and attitudes, but they are not self-critical. They are moved into action by impulse or by inclination, simply as it comes, without the mediation of any reflective consideration or criticism of their own motives. Insofar as they lack the capacity to form attitudes towards themselves, there is for them no possibility either of self-acceptance or of mobilizing an inner resistance to what they are. They can neither identify with the forces that move them nor distance themselves from those forces. And along similar lines, the self-awareness that is characteristic of human beings makes us susceptible to an inner division in which we separate from and objectify ourselves. This puts us in a position to assess the motivating forces by which we happen to be impelled and to determine which of them to accept, or as he sometimes says, identify with, and which to resist or disidentify with. And his kind of token example of an agent who disidentifies with the desires by which he's moved is a figure he calls the unwilling addict, who finds these, what he calls first-order desires for his addictive drug, to be very powerful motivators. But when he reflects on the motive or the desire, he kind of pits himself against it. He says, I do not want to act on this desire. He forms a desire not to have the desire, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, let's say he succumbs. This is what Frankfurt thinks is distinctive of persons, that they have this, what he calls hierarchical structure to their will. That they're capable not just of first-order desires, but what Frankfurt calls second or higher-order desires, right? They're capable of assessing, as Frankfurt sometimes says, the desirability of their desires themselves, right? So not just desiring things, but desiring to desire in certain ways. And so obviously you can see why this strikes me as such an interesting way of theorizing about cases like Petra's and cases like Tomas's. Frankfurt is giving us a kind of vocabulary and kind of conceptual repertoire for talking about these alienation or estrangement cases, which seem like real kind of experiences within our moral life, one that has been heretofore, I think, underappreciated by philosophers. So Frankfurt has this kind of, this really cool conception of what's special about us as persons, the hierarchical structure of our will, but he doesn't stop there. And this is what makes his work, I think, so fascinating. He begins to use that conception of the person to illuminate and think differently about all sorts of traditional philosophical concepts, right? So, for starters, he's going to use this conception of a person's will to kind of define a new kind of freedom of the will, a kind or sense of freedom of the will that he thinks we are most interested in, and perhaps more importantly, he thinks is the sense of freedom of the will most relevant to moral responsibility. Right, so he says famously in, well, not famously, he just says it, but it's a famous essay, right? One that again, you can't say that in philosophy. I doubt you've ever heard of it. Okay, so he says, in my view, the relationship between free will and moral responsibility has been very widely misunderstood. He's fond of saying things like that, right? Like everybody who's thought about these things before me, not so much. And so what he wants to say is, as I put it here, he wants to say moral responsibility requires less, that should say freedom, than one traditional view requires, and more freedom than another traditional view requires. Let me try to explain what I mean. There's a very traditional view in the history of Western philosophy which says that the kind of freedom that moral responsibility requires is like a contra-causal freedom. It's the freedom to, having acted, done otherwise than one does, right? It's the presence of robust alternative possibilities at the moment of choice or action. That's the kind of freedom that moral responsibility requires. If Nathan is morally responsible for hitting me with the bat, then at the moment Nathan hit me with the bat, the world must be such that it could have gone differently, and Nathan could have chosen at that moment not to hit me with the bat. In other words, there's a long-standing, venerable tradition that says freedom and moral responsibility are incompatible with causal determinism, right? Frankfurt says no. In fact, the kind of freedom that is relevant to moral responsibility does not require the presence of alternative possibilities. So in principle, there's no incompatibility with the truth of determinism and free will or moral responsibility. Frankfurt wants to say that the kind of freedom of the will that should interest beings like ourselves, beings that have these hierarchically structured wills, the kind of freedom we're interested in, principally and primarily, is having the wills we want to have, right? In other words, the satisfaction of our higher order desires. So the reason the unwilling addict lacks freedom in a real concrete sense is that he can't have the will he wants. He doesn't want to act on his desires for his addictive drug of choice, but he cannot help himself. He acts on that desire anyway. That's the kind of lack of freedom which kind of exercises us. When we have the wills we want, Frankfurt wants to say, it doesn't matter in the final analysis whether we could have had a different will. We have the will we want. Maybe it's true the world could have gone differently, maybe it isn't. That's a metaphysical issue Frankfurt thinks is kind of a distant concern when you're talking about what we want out of freedom and why we think it matters to responsibility assessment. So he says here, suppose someone is performing an action that he wants to perform, and that his motive in performing this action is the motive by which he truly wants to be motivated. This person is in no way unwilling or indifferent, either with respect to what he is doing or with respect to the desire that moves him to do it. Neither the action nor the desire that motivates it is imposed upon him against his will or without his acceptance. With respect neither to the one nor to the other is he merely a passive bystander. Under these conditions, the person is enjoying as much freedom as it is reasonable for us to desire. This is as close to freedom of the will as finite beings who do not create themselves can intelligibly hope to come. In other words, we should stop thinking that what moral responsibility requires or what is desirable in the first place is a kind of freedom that requires us stepping outside of the causal order. We should stop thinking that moral responsibility requires anything like the possibility, having acted one way, to have done something different. For Frankfurt, it's just a matter of whether we have the wills we want, whether our higher order desires are being satisfied. And one cool thing about that view, amongst many cool things, I think, is it explains why free will matters to us, right? If free will is desire satisfaction, well, even philosophers tend to agree that desire satisfaction matters to us, right? We tend to prefer when our desires are satisfied. So free will becomes this just really important set of desires. And the issue is, are they being satisfied or not, right? It requires more than another traditional view, though, because classical compatibilists, those who would argue that the kind of freedom relevant to moral responsibility is perfectly compatible with the truth of causal determinism, they would say things like, look, as long as you're doing what you want to do, you're free. But Frankfurt points out, recall the unwilling addict. The unwilling addict might have no trouble satisfying his desire for his addictive drug of choice. He's unlikely to strike us as a paragon of freedom. He certainly doesn't feel free. He feels like a slave to his passions. So the fact that he doesn't encounter any obstacles, the fact that he's in no way inhibited from satisfying his first-order addictive desires, does not entail his freedom in any kind of significant or interesting sense. So again, Frankfurt's kind of carving out this space for free will and moral responsibility that kind of sets the bar a little bit lower than one traditional camp, but a little bit higher than another. It's kind of like a Goldilocks account of free will, right? One's just a little too demanding, the other's not quite demanding enough, and Frankfurt's, take it from me, is just right. Okay. Oh, this does work. Okay. Okay, so I give you a kind of very schematic overview here of what Frankfurt thinks free will and moral responsibility is all about. Some person has a desire, phi, right? The person reflects on whether that desire is a desire by which she wants to be motivated. The person reflectively endorses or identifies herself with that desire. That desire then moves her to action. In that case, Frankfurt says the person performs the action of her own free will or freely wills to perform the action. And in that case, Frankfurt says the person is morally responsible, fully morally responsible for performing the action. Again, this is highly kind of schematic in the sense that, as I'll soon explain, Frankfurt is not suggesting that at every moment of our practical lives we're kind of running through this program, or if we are running through this program, it's kind of operating under the surface of kind of self-consciousness, right? But this generally, in terms of discrete steps, is what Frankfurt has in mind. And it's this move from having a desire to reflecting on the desirability of the desire itself that is the crucial move that persons are uniquely capable of performing, right? And which is the source of our freedom and responsibility, according to Frankfurt. Okay. I feel very much like I want to stop for questions, but I'll do that at the end. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. You're thinking to yourself, well, who could possibly have anything to say negative about that, right? I mean, it just has the ring of truth to it. But look at Casper Lippert Rasmussen. I'm not making that name up, by the way. That's his name. Look at him up there in the corner. Again, looking very, very smug and self-satisfied. Thinking he's pretty much refuted old Frankfurt, right? So he's kind of responsible for formulating what's called the whim problem. And each of the objections I'm going to present to you now, and I'll run through them pretty quickly, I think they're all ostensibly very compelling. At first glance, they're powerful objections. First, we can think of acting on a whim. Don't think of it too narrowly, as like ordinary English when we would say somebody was acting on a whim. Think of acting on a whim will stipulate, it simply means acting on a desire without first engaging in reflective self-evaluation. Without like stepping back and saying, but is this a desire by which I want to be motivated? Right? Just straight away, you want something, you go for it. Right? That's what acting on a whim is going to mean, according to Casper Lippert Rasmussen. And then we have an argument like this. He doesn't put it exactly this way, but I think this is a very perspicuous way to put it. If Frankfurt is right that identification with one's will is necessary for moral responsibility, then we are never morally responsible for what we do when acting on a whim. But we are sometimes morally responsible for what we do when acting on a whim. Therefore, Frankfurt's account of moral responsibility is incorrect. The idea here, simply put, is that according to Lippert Rasmussen, it seems like Frankfurt ties morally responsible agency to a kind of reflective agency, which is the exception rather than the rule. So it's going to fall out of a picture like that, that moral responsibility is the exception rather than the rule. It better not, though. Moral responsibility seems like it should be the rule and not the exception. So there's something wrong with Frankfurt's account. That's the whim problem. 3 responses to the whim problem. Things are going to get increasingly less clear because now we're getting to the parts of the paper where, I only have my own brain to go off of. I can't just describe to you what people much smarter than myself have said. So 3 responses to the whim problem. 1, you might think, well, maybe we can introduce some idea of counterfactual identification. We can say that, it's true that we sometimes act without the benefit of reflective self-evaluation. We sometimes act without scrutinizing our desires or subjecting them to critical reflection. But maybe all Frankfurt requires for identification is not actual on-the-spot reflective endorsement, but counterfactual endorsement. If the agent were to reflect on the desire in question, he or she would then reflectively endorse acting on that desire. Maybe that would be one way to get around the problem of maybe Lippert Rasmussen's whim problem, right? I'm not so keen on that response. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but one thing I don't like about it is it's not clear to me why counterfactual identification should make a crucial difference. When I think of cases like Petra's or cases like Thomas's, it seems reasonable that they wouldn't identify with the desires on which they acted. There wouldn't be counterfactual identification, yet it seems far from obvious to me that thereby somehow that absolves them of responsibility, or that gets them off the hook. The fact that had they reflected, they would have kind of clearly judged the undesirability of the desire and disidentified with it, doesn't mean they didn't identify with it at the time of acting, and that seems like the more relevant consideration when determining their moral responsibility. Another possible response is to say, well, perhaps identification with the desires by which one is motivated, maybe it's just sufficient for moral responsibility but not necessary. That's a philosopher's way of saying that if you wholeheartedly identify with or endorse the desires on which you act, then you're morally responsible. However, to say it's not necessary is to say you might be morally responsible even if you don't wholeheartedly identify with the desires on which you act. Again, that would be a response to the whim problem, but it seems to me like it gives up a lot. Frankfurt's view is more interesting if we can somehow retain identification as a necessary and not just sufficient condition for moral responsibility. So that brings me to the view that, this is all based on a paper I'm writing, by the way, that brings me to the view that I think is the most promising of the 3. And this is a very poorly written sentence. I'll try to explain it to you. Perhaps the ability of a desire or motive to move us to action without provoking reflective self-evaluation signals our acceptance of or identification with that desire or motive. So what am I trying to say here? Basically, I think what we need to do, I think Lippert Rasmussen is operating with far too narrow a conception of identification in Frankfurt's work. We have to ask, well, what sets the reflective wheels in motion? When are human beings predisposed to step back from a desire and pose the question, is this a desire by which I want to be motivated? And my suggestion is, it's going to be, by and large, cases in which, or when there's something about the desire which causes some sort of momentary identification crisis. Doesn't mesh well with their other desires, values, cares, commitments. It somehow doesn't cohere with their other desires, values, cares, commitments. That's what kind of causes the distancing move in the first place, right? For the most part, I think we move through the world and we feel desires and we act on those desires. And if we're not pausing after every single motive to ask whether, well, is this a motive by which I want to be moved? I think it's because, by and large, we're not assailed by motives that strike us as somehow alien or external or at odds with our values, cares, commitments, right? The idea is, for the most part, we're assailed by motives that are very much consonant with our desires, values, cares, commitments. And because of that, there's no reflective detachment or distancing. But that doesn't mean that there's no identification. Rather, it means that identification is something like a default condition. And because the desire doesn't offend against one's existing higher order desires, values, cares, commitments, the distancing move never has to occur, right? Same way, the best explanation of why you don't take issue with something I said here today might be that you find it agreeable, and not that you're simply refusing to ask whether you agree with it or not, right? You're more likely to take issue with the things I say that suddenly strike you as somehow wrong or incorrect, or at odds with whatever beliefs you currently have about the way this all falls out, right? Well, there might be some practical analog to that. The reflective move might only happen in those cases where we're somehow unsettled about what our kind of attitude towards the motive or desire should be. So this is the general kind of strategy I want to use to respond to Lippert Rasmussen. He's operating with too narrow a conception of identification. He equates identification wrongly with like an explicit reflective endorsement. I don't think Frankfurt's committed to that narrow a conception of identification. Okay. Another villain of this piece. The weakness of will, but that's not my mom, by the way. That's Kristen Wiig. On the left, that's Francois Schroeder. He's another philosopher who has the audacity to tell Frankfurt he's wrong about something. And so he presented this criticism. It's called the weakness of will problem, right? And the reason why there's a picture here of Kristen Wiig posing as a mother is that in the example Schroeder gives us, he's talking about a case where he has a desire to watch television, he has a desire to call his mother. He judges the desire to call his mother as the one that he ought to act on, but to hell with it, he just keeps watching television, right? And he says, here's a case of what I'll call minor weakness of will. If Frankfurt is right that disidentification with one's will is sufficient for lacking moral responsibility, as Frankfurt sometimes seems to suggest, then we are not morally responsible for what we do when acting from minor weakness of will. But we are sometimes morally responsible for what we do when acting from minor weakness of will. After all, he's blameworthy for leaving mom on the hook, right? Therefore, Frankfurt's account of moral responsibility is incorrect. So whereas Lippert Rasmussen was trying to show that identification with one's affective desires cannot actually be a necessary condition for moral responsibility, Schroeder's coming at the argument a bit differently, or the account a bit differently. Schroeder's trying to show that disidentification cannot be sufficient for lacking moral responsibility. So I'll be quicker about this. Not quick enough for that kid, though, apparently. A response to the weakness of will problem. We need to distinguish disidentification from mere disapproval and or practical/rational judgment. I think there's a kind of similar error here. Lippert Rasmussen operates with too narrow a conception of identification. Schroeder is operating with too narrow a conception of disidentification. He wrongly equates disidentification in Frankfurt to a kind of practical judgment against something, like I should not do that, or I don't have reason to do that, or all things considered, I ought not to do that. Those are important practical judgments. They figure into our practical lives, but that's not what Frankfurt means by disidentification. Disidentification is a kind of volitional opposition in Frankfurt. It's not just practical judgment telling you that you shouldn't do something, or you don't have reason to do something, or it's immoral, or it would be irrational or imprudent. Those forms of cognitive judgment about what one has reasons to do, that's not what Frankfurt means by disidentification. Disidentification in Frankfurt involves the formation of higher order countervailing desires. Desires not to do what some other desire represents a motive force to do, right? And so for Frankfurt, agents who genuinely disidentify with the desires by which they're motivated in the relevant sense, they're always going to experience real, concrete, volitional struggle and resistance. They're going to be divided selves. They're going to be pulled in two different directions. there's going to be some evidence of that opposition and volitional struggle. It's not just going to be the kind of cool-headed Socratic agent who's like, well, I know I shouldn't do this, but what the hell. That person isn't volitionally divided. There might be division between their practical judgment and their will, but their will itself isn't divided. In Frankfurt, disidentification implies a division in the will itself, desires going against each other. So Frankfurt says, someone may act out of jealousy or out of a desire for revenge, although he disapproves of these motives and would strongly prefer that he not be driven by them. Unhappily, as it turns out, their force is too great for him to withstand, and in the end, he submits to it. Despite his resistance, the unwelcome desire is effective in moving him to act. And this is me putting it in bold. Given that he opposed it as well as he could, it may then reasonably be said that the desire has moved him and that he has consequently acted against his own will, right? So for it ever to be reasonable to say of some person that he did X against his own will, there has to be some evidence that he ever willed the opposite of X, right? It can't just be a judgment that he thinks, all things considered, it would have been better to do the opposite of X, because that judgment just may not engage his will at all, right? There are things I think it would be better if I do these things, and they completely and utterly fail to engage my will. I don't take any steps towards doing them. I mean, maybe the only thing I ever do is like just wistfully think, oh yeah, wouldn't my life be better if I had even the slightest inclination to do those things that I think would be in my best interest, right? No, I don't want to reveal too much. I could give you way too many examples. I showed you the still shot of the guy with the brandy. Okay. So, yeah, so my response here is that it's a bit of a straw man, the weakness of will problem. If we imagine that little dramatic scene between Schroeder and his mother, but now Schroeder is not just coolly thinking, oh, I should probably call Mom, oh, to hell with it, but is in fact like really volitionally divided and torn up about it, and as Frankfurt often says, like opposing it as well as he could. I mean, it seems silly given such a minor case, but if we imagine all that, well, then it becomes correspondingly less obvious that he's morally responsible for the failure, right? So that's the general strategy for responding to the weakness of will problem. Okay. Now this is the most probably, well, I don't want to say it's the most serious problem. It's the most common objection that Frankfurt has had to kind of field. I leave it to the end, and I have less to say about it in general because Frankfurt himself has addressed it explicitly, and I don't yet feel like I have anything to say that would expand or improve upon what Frankfurt himself has said. But here's the objection. It's called the manipulation problem. And what this is supposed to show is that identification cannot possibly be, as Frankfurt suggests, sufficient for the kind of freedom that gives us moral responsibility or makes one morally responsible. You can think, this is how I put it. Actions that arise as the result of manipulation are not freely willed actions for which the person is morally responsible. We're supposed to just take that as given, right? Premise 2, actions that arise as the result of manipulation may be actions that arise as the result of a person's higher order desires or acceptance of his motives or endorsement, whatever Frankfurt wants to say is the condition for free action. Therefore, freely willed actions for which the person is morally responsible are not equivalent to actions caused by the person's higher order desires, acceptance, endorsement, etc. In other words, however Frankfurt cashes out his idea of free willing, we can imagine a case, however exotic, where those conditions are brought about through some external manipulator. And since we're all going to think in that case, person P isn't morally responsible, we're going to have a case where somebody's not morally responsible, yet Frankfurt's conditions have been satisfied. That looks like a problem for Frankfurt. So what does Frankfurt say in response to this? He looks unfazed by it, as you can see. And this is a huge literature, this part. The other problems he hasn't responded to, that's why I'm focusing on them, but I thought this would come up in Q&A anyway, so I should mention it. He wants to ask us, well, look, what worries us about manipulation generally? And his idea is basically that we tend to think manipulated agents aren't morally responsible and they're not free because we kind of automatically assume that the manipulation is leading them to do things they don't really want to do, right? That's why manipulation in our minds tends to undermine freedom and responsibility. But we shouldn't assume that, right? In other words, we tend to think manipulation undermines responsibility. The best account for why that is Frankfurt's own account. That it undermines responsibility because it kind of alienates, or it causes people to be estranged from their own manipulated behavior. But if we imagine the case is such that the thing that somebody is being manipulated into doing is something they anyway wholeheartedly and all the way down want to do, well, then our intuitions about whether it would be, or whether we'd have any justification in holding the reactive attitudes with respect to them, become correspondingly less clear. It's not so obvious that those persons don't deserve blame, or in any way kind of censure, and so forth. So that's his response to the general manipulation problem. Okay, I feel like, yeah, that's the end of the slideshow. Thank you.